Here we are on section 6.4 where we're going to do some algebra with trig functions. We have some shorthand notations where we use S for the sine and C for the cosine and T for the tangent, S squared for sine squared, cosine squared, tangent squared. If we recall from our unit circles, we know that x squared plus y squared equals 1 on that unit circle. So if we replace our sine and cosine with those x and y's or vice versa, we get that the cosine squared plus the sine squared equals 1. Similarly, we know that the tangent is the sine divided by cosine, and we get all these other shorthand notation stuff. You should take the time to pause this and write it down. So, what we're going to do is we're going to do some simplifying with this. One of the first methods that I'm going to teach you is to change everything into sine and cosine. So I'm going to say this is the sine of x divided by the cosine of x. Notice I'm not using any shortcuts yet. And this is 1 over the sine squared minus sine over the cosine. And if we look for simplifying here, we know that I can divide the sine and then the square would go away here. And so I'm left with 1 over sine times cosine minus sine over cosine. And then to get a common denominator, I'm going to multiply both top and bottom by sine. So when I do that, I have 1 minus sine squared all over sine times cosine. Well, we know that if we take our sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, and I can subtract sine from both sides, so 1 minus the sine squared is equal to the cosine squared. And doing that substitution and then simplifying, I get cosine over sine, and we know that the cosine over sine is the cotangent. So my answer is cotangent. Now we can do the same process on this second one. And I'm going to say sine x plus this cotangent is cosine over sine times the cosine. And so I end up wanting to get a common denominator here because one of them, well, anytime you can get a common denominator, it's probably going to be good. So I'm going to multiply this first one, top and bottom, by the sine of x. So I get, with that, I get, let's go down here, I'm going to need to do some erasing before I do this. I get sine squared plus cosine squared all over the sine of x. And from this over here, I know I can do the substitution 1 over sine, which is the cosecant. All right, take some time to write that down. I'm going to erase. All right, hope you had that paused in time. So then let's factor. Second method I'm going to talk about here is factoring. So we have the sine to the fourth minus the cosine. So I'm going to use the difference of squares here. And I'm going to get sine squared a minus cosine squared a sine squared a plus cosine squared a, all over the cosine of a minus the sine of a. Well, we know, because it's right here, that this guy here with the plus in it is going to go to 1, and 1 times anything, it just goes away. But wait, there's more. It's like an infomercial. We still have sine squared minus cosine squared, and we can factor that into the sine of a plus the sine or cosine of a times sine of a minus cosine a, all over the sine or cosine of a. I have it backwards. Cosine of a minus sine of a. Well, just so happens that we have sine of A minus cosine of A, and that's just -1 times this bottom thing. So if I multiply the top one by -1, I get these to go away, and so then I'm left with the negative sine of A plus cosine of A. And on the bottom, let's erase that. On the bottom one here, we have bottom 2 here, we're going to use these shortcut letters. Let you be introduced to those a little bit. So I'm going to say my cotangent squared is the, slow it up, is the cosine squared over the sine squared. We're going to divide that by 1 over the sine squared, plus sine squared over cosine squared divided by 1 over the cosine squared. Alright, so when we divide, we multiply by the reciprocal, so this would become s squared over 1, and I'm left with cosine. Down here, same dealio, and I'm left with sine squared. And we know that sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. Alright, let's see if we can make a little room for this one. And I'm going to change it into, this one doesn't look as nice, so let's rewrite it as sine over cosine plus sine over cosine times sine minus cosine times sine, all over sine times sine over cosine. And to do this, I'm going to want to simplify as best I can. So I'm going to just rewrite it to start with here. I'm going to say this is sine, sine over cosine plus sine squared over cosine minus sine times cosine. But instead of, this would be sine squared over cosine. Instead of dividing by that, I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. And when I do that, I'm going to get a little bit of simplifying here. The cosine on top, cosine on the bottom, gone. Cosine on top, one of the cosines on the bottom, gone. So I'm left with 1 over the sine. In the second term, I'm just left with 1. And minus, I'm going to be getting this one of the sines go away. So I end up with cosine squared over sine. Now, I'm going to want to move that up there because there's some more steps here. And I have 1 over the sine plus 1 minus. But I'm going to change this so it's all in sine. And up here we talked about the sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And since I have the cosine, I can rewrite that as 1 minus sine. So up here, I'm going to say 1 minus the sine squared. Oops, just 1 minus s, I guess is what I'm going to write. 1 minus s squared. And then I'm going to get my common denominator. So if I'm going to have an s, because we already have an s on the bottom here, I want to rewrite this as 1 plus s. I'm going to write 1 as s over s. And then I'm going to say minus 1 plus s squared all over s. So this 1 became s over s here. And the 1 and the negative 1 go away. So I'm left with s plus s squared all over s. Simplify that down, gives me 1 plus s. So I get 1 plus sine after all that simplifying. All right. So now, in the second examples here, we have, they tell us what it's going to be equal to, which seems to me to be nicer. So, but the deal is that you can only work with one side. So you're going to take the messiest side and work with that. And the messiest, well, 1 is pretty simple, so it's not going to be that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change everything into sine and cosine. I'm not going to use the shortcuts here. You guys, if you like the shortcuts, go ahead. Sine times 1 over cosine all over sine over cosine equals 1. And then I'm going to rewrite that as sine over cosine because I'm multiplying on top. And then I have that over sine over cosine. And anything divided by itself is 1, so this becomes 1, which is the same as that. Okay? All right. Going to erase because I don't have enough room for the whole thing. So here we're going to do the common denominator. This is the messier side because there's a fraction. So I'm going to write 1 over sine. And then I'm going to write it as a common denominator, sine squared over sine. So I get the common denominator, which makes 1 minus the sine squared over sine. And we know that 1 minus sine is the same as cosine. So that gives me cosine squared over 1 minus sine over sine. Oops, not 1 minus, just over the sine. And then we're going to bust this up into cosine over sine times cosine again. So I'm breaking up the squared into that. This becomes cotangent times cosine. And that's what we were looking for. And we got one more of these. Let me erase so I have enough room. Make sure you're pausing these. I'm going to do my common denominator again. And so I'm going to have sine squared plus 1 plus cosine beta squared all over sine beta times 1 plus cosine beta equals this 2 cosecant. So now that I have that, I'm going to need a lot of room here, so I'm going to rewrite this as sine squared beta plus 1 plus 2 cosine beta plus cosine squared beta, just spoiling that guy out, all over sine beta 1 plus cosine beta. Now we have the sine squared and the cosine squared, these two guys together, we know that makes 1, plus the 1 that's already up there, plus 2 cosine beta, all over sine beta plus cosine beta. And if I put these together and factor out that 2, I get 2 times 1 plus cosine beta, all over the sine beta times 1 plus cosine beta. Cross those out and move the sign to the top. That would be a cosecant on the top. And there we got our answer. All right, now this is a lot of fun. Make sure you practice those on your homework because they are important.